have a student who you believe requires assistive technology or who is currently using assistive technology and you feel maybe you need to switch it up and change out the assistive technology? And have you been at the meeting and the team has said, well, we really don't need to do that. You know, they might just delay the process a little bit. That's what our tip is about today.
The federal law actually requires that assistive technology be considered at every IEP revision. So that means at least annually, since the IEP has to convene at least annually. At least once a year, assistive technology has to be considered for the student. So that's a lot. That's at least once a year. And if you haven't been discussing it in a while, you want to make sure that at every meeting, you know you have a right to bring it up. Most overlooked and underserved related services under the IDEA, in my view, is something called parent counseling and training. Parent counseling and training is a related service that basically helps parents to understand child development, helps them to understand their child's disability, as well as to give them the skills that they need in order to support the child's IEP, and yet very rarely is it offered by school districts.
And that's our tip for the day. We want you to understand that there is a related service called parent training, and it's designed specifically for you. Has your school team talked about response to intervention, or RTI, about your student? If they have, there's a lot of controversy and confusion relating around this subject, and that's what our tip is about today.
A lot of times RTI is brought up when a team, an IEP team, is considering a student's eligibility under the IDEA. And so here's the most important thing we want you to know. First of all, RTI is really only supposed to be considered for students whose suspected disability is a learning disability, a specific learning disability. So if there's another disability that you as a team suspect, RTI really isn't supposed to factor in. And also the federal government has made it very clear that RTI is not to be used to delay a parent's right to make sure that their child is timely evaluated.
The other thing that I just want to point out about RTI is it is a regular education initiative that can't be used for an excuse if you want to refer your child to special education. Have you ever heard of a 504 plan? Well, that may be confused with something else you've heard, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Jen's going to bring some clarity to you about those two things.
So it's really one thing, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. But there are 504 plans, which are accommodations plans, but that's very different from what we call the anti-discrimination provisions of Section 504. So Section 504 also prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability to any entity that receives federal funding. And so you can't deny access to any benefit or service of an entity that receives federal funding, which all public schools do. And so if you believe that you or your child is being discriminated against because of disability, this portion of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is enforced by the United States Department of Education's OCR, which stands for Office for Civil Rights. You can go right onto their website, look up OCR, and you can file a complaint right there.
If you're planning an independent evaluation for your child and the school district has agreed, or perhaps you're doing it on your own, to have somebody from the outside come in and evaluate your child, and they want to observe your child in the school setting, that's what our tip is about today, the right to have your school evaluator observe.
One of the problems is that very often school districts will significantly limit or prohibit the observation by an outside evaluator in a way that they wouldn't with someone they retained to come in and evaluate the child. And this is inconsistent with federal law. The Supreme Court of the United States has in fact reiterated that parents' right to that independent evaluation, including the right to have that person observe the child in school, is integral to their procedural safeguards. And so while a school district can put reasonable limits, so you obviously have to have an appointment,
Right.
and you can't come in for the whole day, or maybe you
Can't
restricted-
disrupt.
Exactly. There are rules that can be put around it. Your school district really cannot lawfully prevent you from having your evaluator observe your child in school. Until a student reaches the age of majority in their state, their rights under the federal special education laws are held by their parents. And then when that student reaches the age of majority, there comes the transfer of rights, which is the passage of the rights from the parents to the student.
Right, and this is what our tip is on today. We want you to understand that there is something called transfer of rights, and it happens in your state for whatever the age of majority is in your state. So you're going to want to make sure that you know what that age is. Don't get caught without knowing that it's coming up, and prepare yourself for it with your IEP team. In my practice, I work with many families whose young children are in early intervention services, and they're being referred to special education to see if they're eligible for special education within the public school system. There's something that happens in my practice so often that bothers me that we wanted to make sure that we brought it to you as a tip for the day. Here's essentially what happens. The school district's obligation is to evaluate in all suspected areas of disability. So I'm the school district, you're the early intervention provider. So as the school district, I look to you, the early intervention provider, who has already done all of these beautiful evaluations. And I, the school district, say, they're so great, we're going to adopt them, and we're going to use all that information to find your child eligible or not, and to plan programming. The problem with that is that if you disagree with those evaluations, some districts don't consider them their own evaluations. They'll say, well, we never did our own evaluations. Those were the early intervention providers' evaluations. So Jen, bring it home. Here's our tip.
Here's our tip. If your school district elects not to evaluate your child when you're coming from early intervention, you want to have it documented that the school district has adopted the early intervention evaluations as their initial evaluations.
If you've ever been at an IEP team meeting and your team has suggested removing a service or changing placement, and you sit there and perhaps are panicked because you don't know what to do, our tip of the day today is to let you know there's something called stay put.
Stay put is a procedural protection that parents have, and what it really means, even though it's a very complex subject, is that when parents and a school district agree on a program and placement, and then the school wants to change it, the parent has a right to say, I disagree with that change in placement, and invoke stay put by filing for a due process hearing. So you don't just get it because you disagree. There are procedures that are in place that you'd have to invoke in order to have this protection, and they vary somewhat depending on your state. But what you should know is if you've reached an agreement with your school district about your child's placement and then they want to change it, you have rights, and those rights lie in stay put.
I recently had a client who asked her IEP team for a referral to special education in June, which of course is the end of the school year. And her school district flatly denied her. We ended up having to put a complaint into the State Department of Education, and it was resolved. But that's what our tip is about today, that you can ask to be referred to special education at any time during the year.
You can, and end of the school year referrals can be quite tricky because what you have to look at are the timelines for evaluation and then reconvening of the IEP team under your state's timelines, because the federal government kind of leaves a lot of the timelines up to the state. So you need to be in touch with your State Department of Education, find out from when that referral starts or when the consent to evaluate starts, when does the team need to get back together again to consider the IEP and the referral, because it may be school days, it may be calendar days, and they're very different over the summer. So you can still make that referral at the end of the school year, but you're going to want to check with your state. Often parents will be told the IEP team meeting for your child is scheduled for X and such date, at X and such time, at X and such place. And parents often can't make the meeting, and they don't realize that in fact that meeting must be scheduled at a mutually agreeable date, time, and location.
And I've got a really good tip for this that I share with my clients. First of all, I believe very strongly that you can't change somebody else's behavior unless you change your own. So it's really training people up to understand that we need to make this at a mutually agreeable time. And I mean that in the nicest way. But just start writing emails if they've sent you an invitation and you can't make that date, a very polite, kind email which states, "I'm sorry I can't make that date. However, I can make these following dates. If you'd please choose one that work for you and for me, I'd be most appreciative." And that's our tip for the day.